All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming. Great to see you all. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to acknowledge J. Carter Brown behind me. He was a member of the Brown family, very important figure. He was director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington for 23 years. Very important position, organized a lot of blockbuster shows in Washington from about 69 to 92, 1969 to 1992, long before many of you were born. And then, more important, I think, for our purpose here tonight, he was chair of the Pritzker Award Committee for also 23 years, from 79 to 2002, when he passed away. And many of you have heard of the Pritzker Award, which we consider the Nobel Prize in Architecture, which is handed out every year to a major figure in our field of architecture. And he led that committee, and when he passed away in 2002, the Pritzker Foundation in Chicago gave a fund to the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage to honor J. Carter Brown with a series of lectures about architecture. And so we've been doing this since 2002 for more than 20 years and have had a fantastic range of major figures in the field of architecture, also a few scholars, more practicing architects, but tonight we have a scholar and a curator. And before I introduce him, I wanted to also thank Kevin McLaughlin, who is the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center today, who gave us access to the funds and supported our project of continuing this lecture series, and Victoria Hood, who is on his team, senior fellow at the JNBC, for all of her help organizing it and helping organize our poster, and Christian Bilodeau from our department, who also helped organize all the details. So it's really fantastic. And on that note, I want to come and introduce our speaker. And I must say, it's such a pleasure to be in what I consider Philip Johnson's best building, and to introduce the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. It's an amazing position. I think, without exaggeration, one can say this is probably in the field of architecture curation the world's most prominent and best position. I think there's nothing like it. And when I look at your portfolio, it's quite amazing. Martino basically makes all the decisions at MoMA about exhibitions, about installations, about acquisitions, in the field of architecture and design, as a big team that he works with. And he came from Switzerland, studied art history in Zurich at the university there, and then went to the ETH, which is the State Federal University in Zurich, and got his PhD there. Had several teaching positions, became a professor in Zurich University, and then was called by MoMA to become the new chief curator for architecture and design. And wrote some fantastic books coming out of his PhD thesis, one on Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown that we've just talked about at length in our lecture course here, and another one on montage and architecture, or rather montage and the metropolis, architecture, modernity, and the representation of space. And I'm really impressed with his shows at MoMA. We talked about it. We did a little campus tour together. You want to see all our modern architecture, and chatted about it. I think the shows that he did at MoMA, there's, I'm thinking about a wonderful exhibition about contemporary architecture in China. But closer to my heart even, although I love that Chinese show, are those, it's like a triumvirate of shows that deal very deeply with historical architecture in the post-war period in parts of the world that were under-considered before Martino came to MoMA. And I think maybe part of an inspiration was a show that was just starting when you came in 2015 about Latin American architecture. But then Martino, in fact, created his own path with a great show about Yugoslavia in the post-war period called Towards a Concrete Utopia, all brutalism, the best kind of brutalism all over the place, incredible memorials. Then came the Project of Independence, architecture of decolonization in South Asia. Again, lots of architects we hadn't really encountered before, and brilliant work. And then now, of course, this summer, on July 5th, opens his Architects of Liberation, Modernism in Western Africa, which he curated together with Ikem Stanley Okoye, a wonderful colleague at the University of Delaware. So these are all really contributions to our field in a deep scholarly fashion. And in a way, that's, for me, almost the most noble pursuit that a museum can undertake, to really broaden the discourse, not just with temporary shows, but with great accompanying catalogs. And I think this is a fantastic accomplishment. So he won many awards from the ETH and the Swiss Art Award for Architecture Criticism, awards from the Society of Architecture Historians, the German Architecture Museum, and many others. But before I list all of them, I would like to invite Martino up on the stage. Please help me welcome Martino Stierli.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining me here tonight. Thank you so much, Dietrich, for the wonderful invitation and very generous introduction. Also, warm welcome to all of you who helped working behind the stages to make this happen tonight. So my lecture has two main, that's actually your slide, here's my title slide, has two main parts. First, I'm going to do a general introduction into sort of the curatorial vision that stands behind the exhibition that we have been working on for the last 4 years. Architects of Liberation, as Dietrich said, is going to open at MoMA in July. Early July, and will be up for the entire second half of the year, so you'll have ample time to go visit it. The second half of my lecture will then focus in on one country and just a few buildings, and hence the title of the talk, Asymmetric Parallelism. I'll come to what that's supposed to mean, architecture and politics in Senghor's Senegal. So here just a quick, geography lesson. Of course, you're all familiar with the idea of where Africa is, West Africa specifically, or Western Africa. I'm coming to that too. The 7 countries that we're looking at, you see highlighted here. I'll also explain why it is these 7 countries. The exhibition will be organized thematically, so not country by country, but overarching larger themes. I'm showing them to you here. Networks of modernization, for example, looks sort of the buildup of large infrastructure, including traffic, roads, railways, but also factories and so on. Cityscapes, the construction of new city centers, and so on and so forth. So it's 6 major themes, each of which we designated one anchor project to, meaning one building that we found particularly evocative or significant within that larger theme. And you see these countries listed here. I'm going to talk in depth about one of them this evening, which relates to the theme of event architecture, by which we mean mainly international trade fairs, and this is the International Trade Fair Ground in Dakar, Senegal. In addition to these 6 themes, we will have monographic inserts, which will give us the opportunity to highlight some of the most prominent architects who were active in this period that we're looking at, mainly 1960s and 1970s in the region. We have Sheikh Ngom, the first Senegalese-born and trained architect, Jean Léon, an Ivoirian architect, then Alan Vaughan Richard, British-born, but then emigrated to Nigeria, became Nigerian, and then Henri Chaumet, French, who built an entire empire of architectural offices all across Africa. A very under appreciated figure, I think, until now. As Dietrich has already mentioned, Architects of Liberation is the 3rd in a trilogy of exhibitions that I have organized at MoMA that explore the relationship between modernist architecture and political emancipation movements around the globe. Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia, 1948 to 80, which was up in 2018, began examining connections between architecture, national identity, and self-assertion. The Project of Independence, Architectures of Decolonization in South Asia, extended this line of inquiry by highlighting architectural production in a region that functioned as a blueprint for decolonization efforts worldwide. And the current exhibition on Africa, on Western Africa, builds on these precedents, examining this body of work as both regionally distinctive and a part of a broader global network in the context of the Cold War. Expectations for a future of unlimited potential abounded in the period of political liberation and decolonization across the African continent. In 1957, Ghana successfully, the Gold Coast as it was then called, Ghana peacefully gained independence from British rule, and in 1960, the Year of Africa, 17 African nations achieved political autonomy after long struggles of self-determination. At this historical moment and in its immediate aftermath, bold aspirations and an optimistic outlook onto a world yet to come, which would never be fully realized, took form in cultural accomplishments. The promises of modern life were embraced and expressed in the realms of music, literature, and the visual arts alike, and many artists during this period gained recognition well beyond their fledgling nations. And I'm showing you just some of the media representations of this really sort of cultural awakening that came along with this moment of liberation at mid-century. Architecture, too, played a significant role in the desire of newly independent African countries to project both inward and outward a forward-looking, progressive, and cosmopolitan self-image. The architectural production that channeled these political, economic, and cultural aspirations are the subject of our exhibition. Our focus, as I mentioned, concerns the legacies of modern architecture in the post-independence era in 7 countries: Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, and Cameroon, and Senegal. We refer to this region, the westernmost and primarily coastal part of the continent south of the Sahara, as Western Africa. Our use of this designation marks a deliberate distinction from colonial nomenclature, which specifically talked about West Africa in the British context and Afrique de l'Ouest in the French. We consider countries and cities that experience colonial rule by either Britain or France, along with Togo and Cameroon, which were ruled by both countries, as well as for a time by Germany. In contrast to the Berlin Conference of 1884, which established the boundaries problematically between nation-states along entirely arbitrarily drawn borders that completely neglected pre-existing ethnic and cultural realities, our investigation treats these 7 countries not as a fragmented territory, but a shared cultural space and as places that dealt with decolonization in similar ways. Hence, rather than discussing the complex individual histories of each country, which we also want to acknowledge, our exhibition foregrounds the shared embrace of architectural modernism as a response to the challenge and promise of liberation. Other regions in Africa would lend themselves to a similar inquiry, with the tide of liberation forcefully traveling throughout the entire continent within only a few years. Western Africa stands out because of 2 related facts. The process was initiated here, and the region was home to some of the most outspoken and impactful figures of the continental struggle for liberation, several of whom would become their nation's first leaders in the post-independence period, namely Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria. All educated in the West, at least to some extent, these prominent public intellectuals, through their various activities and writings, prepared and fought for eventual independence. If they were thus the political architects of their nation states, as well as the individuals who directed their actual architectural modernization, the main focus of our exhibition is, of course, on the architects who designed the buildings that would come to epitomize and embody the tenets of liberation in the built environment. Many of them did so by embracing a shared cosmopolitan understanding of modernism, while at the same time exploring the possibility of a genuinely African approach to contemporary architectural production. To different degrees, these architects' buildings thus demonstrated allegiance to at least three different and at times competing concepts. One, the specific cultural heritage of a place. Two, the program of nationhood. And three, a cosmopolitan internationalism, often under the rubric of Pan-Africanism. We understand liberation more as a process than a specific moment in time. While political emancipation had been anticipated by the leaders of the liberation movements for decades in both their writings and acts of resistance, the specific moment of the announcement of independence from colonial rule marked only a brief moment of respite in the long march towards true self-determination. That being said, it is after independence that the architectural articulation of the tenets of liberation began to most openly manifest. The chronological focus of our inquiry, therefore, lies in the period from the late 1950s to the early 1980s. Differing notions of modernism had appeared on the continent even before the moment of liberation. The colonial centers of cities such as Dakar and Abidjan featured various Art Deco structures. The British architects Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew in the late 1940s and early 1950s advocated for so-called tropical architecture, which was deeply intertwined with the politics of empire in countries such as Ghana and Nigeria. Conversely, our project explores a plurality of architectural modernisms in the region that, unlike Art Deco or tropical architecture, were not only explicitly aligned with the politics and promise of liberation, but fundamentally tasked with the very articulation of it. The story to be told is complicated by the fact that the first generation of architects working within this framework were for the most part not only foreign trained, but also foreign born. Only through the establishment of universities and schools of higher learning in the immediate post-independence period and the extraordinary campuses that were designed in this context are featured in a large section of the exhibition. I'm showing you here two prominent examples, the University of Ife in Ife, Nigeria, as well as a series of three polytechnic universities in the newly established capital of Yamoussoukro in Côte d'Ivoire. Only once these institutions of higher learnings were established could the first generation of African architects be trained. One notable exception here one notable example here is John Owusu-Addo, who we visited 3.5 years ago, here with my curatorial associate Mallory Cohen on his wonderful porch. One of the earliest architecture students at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana, and also the author and architect of several of the most prominent buildings of that campus, including the staff clubhouse on the top right and the Unity Hall, which is basically dormitories for students, on the lower right. Our project inevitably, for this reason, for the fact that until after political independence there was basically no architecture school anywhere in the region, for this reason inevitably includes the work of a number of French and British expatriate architects, many of whom were active in Africa for many years. While mandating the Africanization of the skilled workforce through education and training, newly independent nations also embraced new geopolitical alliances in the context of the Cold War that sought to diminish the lingering economic dependency on the former colonial power. Eastern European architects and engineers were a strong presence, such as Zoran Bojovic from Yugoslavia and Stefan Kolchev from Bulgaria, who were particularly active in nations that adopted a socialist trajectory or sought to affiliate themselves with the non-aligned movement. I'm showing here two very prominent examples from Nigeria. The trade fair in Lagos, which was designed by Yugoslav architects, and the National Theatre, which opened on the occasion of the Festtag celebration of Pan-African culture in 1977, which was designed by Bulgarian architects. Israeli architects, too, were very active in the region, erecting major buildings in places such as Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, or Yaoundé, Cameroon, and I'm showing you here two hotel examples designed by Israeli architects. Many African nations in the period embraced Pan-Africanism in their approach to international politics. In the early decades of the 20th century, liberation leaders embraced solidarity between peoples of African ancestry with the eventual aim of economic integration and political unification across the continent. While this objective was never accomplished, Pan-Africanism was a foundation of political discourse in the years leading up to and following political independence across all of Western Africa and beyond. How then did the aspiration of Pan-Africanism interact with the establishment of nation-states? On the surface, the two trajectories of nation-building, on the one hand, and Pan-African integration, on the other, would seem to be in conflict. In her seminal study, World-Making After Empire, however, the political scientist Adam Gedochou has argued that decolonization at mid-century should be understood as a reconceptualization of, quote, anti-colonial nationalism as world-making. From this perspective, nationalism and Pan-Africanism were not contradictory, but instead interdependent forces that defined the politics of decolonization across the continent. However, it was precisely by embracing modernism that architects were able to align themselves with the cosmopolitan aspirations of Pan-Africanism, while at the same time contributing to the immediate concerns of nation building. Understood in this way, modernism in Western Africa was not so much a foreign-born concept to be adopted, but rather a malleable set of progressive ideas that African architects put to use in the search for a genuinely African contemporary architecture. And again, I'm showing you here the examples of Jean Léon in Côte d'Ivoire or Sheikh Ngom in Dakar, in Senegal. Therefore, modernism for them was not a continuation of colonialism, but rather a tool of emancipation. In this, we follow Okwi Envesor, the prominent curator of art who passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago, who described the tenets of his seminal exhibition, The Short Century, in the following terms. I'm quoting Envesor. We are not concerned with nor unduly exercised by the modernism dispatched by some colonial envoy and assimilated by Africans. The modernism addressed in this exhibition concerns the African systematization, deployment, and use of modern forms, values, and structure. End quote. And it is this understanding of modernism that we, our team, are particularly interested in exploring, without, however, negating the complex relationship between colonialism and modernism. We are consequently also interested less in the myths of origin and originality surrounding modernism, and more in its mobilization in a specific socioeconomic and cultural context. With the historic moment of liberation receding into the distant past, many of the buildings that were designed in its spirit have long become backdrops of everyday life in the rapidly transforming cities in the region and continue to fulfill their originally intended function. I'm showing you here 3 examples from Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, a market, the city hall, and the Ministry for Telecommunications, all by a French-born architect, and all completely functional and, as you can see, in relatively good shape and well maintained. Other structures, such as Rinaldo Olivieri's Pyramide, Italian architect in Côte d'Ivoire, or Daniel Chenou's Hôtel de la Paix in Togo have been abandoned and face an uncertain future. And actually we have, for those of you who had the chance to visit the Venice Architecture Biennial last year, Togo for the first time participated with its own pavilion, organized by a group of extraordinary young women who actually looked at the modernist legacy of the country, including the Hôtel de la Paix, and we were able to include an interview with these 4 women in our catalogue that is going to be published on the occasion of the exhibition. In yet other instances, significant buildings have been lost altogether, whether through lack of investment, neglect, or violent destruction during times of upheaval or war. As in many regions across the world, the historical and architectural significance of the built heritage of the second half of the 20th century has not yet been fully acknowledged and is under acute distress in certain areas of the world. By raising awareness of the outstanding architectural quality of many of these buildings, as well as for the politics and the histories for which they stand, we hope our exhibition will help to increase appreciation for them. And with this brief introduction into the premises behind the show, the curatorial thinking, I would like to now turn to my specific case study in order to highlight some of the questions at stake in articulating a modern architecture of emancipation in the region. And my example, as already mentioned, is from Senegal, and thus from the francophone part of the continent. In Francophone Western Africa, one of the most powerful concepts developed as part of the struggle for political, economic, and cultural emancipation was that of negritude. In the words of Okwi Enwezor, again, the concept, quote, posited a conscious intellectual dramatization of African alterity and insisted on the reality and originality of an African culture in the making of modernity. End quote. The term negritude, which was coined by the Martinique author Aimé Césaire, was appropriated by a group of black students from the French colonies studying in Paris in the 1930s, among them the future president of Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor, himself a poet. For Senghor, negritude encompassed a series of what he called values of civilization, which were shared by all black peoples around the world. In politics, Senghor identified a, quote, pattern of community-mindedness that was evidenced in, yet another quote, concentric communities scaled up one over the other from the family to the kingdom in what he called a system of reciprocal integration. And in the arts, Senghor in addition identified rhythm and symbolic image as emblematic of negritude. All of these characteristics, as we will see, namely concentricity, the fractal organization of space, rhythm, and symbolic imagery, proved productive in the modern Western African culture of the post-independence period. In later years, critics pointed out the exoticizing and essentializing tendencies in Senghor's theories. Nevertheless, his theory of black cultural empowerment proved fundamental for the articulation of an African mold of modernity in the post-independence period, and in particular in Francophone parts of Western Africa. And specifically for Senegal, Senghor introduced the notion of asymmetric parallelism, which was the title of my talk today, which can be understood as an extension of negritude thinking, and moreover, as an early formulation of the need to negotiate between universalist, meaning modernist concepts on the one hand, and cultural specificity on the other. In this vein, parallelism in asymmetric parallelism would relate to the literal adoption of modernist concepts, whereas asymmetry, asymmetrical, would relate to the creative adaptation to a changed economic and cultural context. In addition to the desire to infuse universalist modernism with a sense of cultural and locational specificity, asymmetric parallelism carries a connotation of geometric order, as prevalent in the patterning of many artifacts of Africa, and in particular textiles. Senghor went one step further. In 1978, in the Law of Orientation of Senegalese Architecture, the Senegalese government went so far as to codify the architectural application of asymmetric parallelism into law. And I think this is a really interesting instance where we have one of the few instances, I think, in the world where we have a government basically codifying an aesthetic vision, an aesthetic language for architecture into the code. Of course, we have other examples in this country, so if people are trying that with more or less success. I am quoting from the law. Without imposing a specific style, and I think that's very important, the law says that, without imposing a specific style that would limit any evolution and any creative inspiration, give architects a general orientation so they can draw their inspiration from the values of Black African civilization, particularly the Sudano-Sahelian. I'm showing you here the Great Mosque of Djenné as the great example of this Sudano-Sahelian style, which is referenced in the law, and I'm continuing to quote from the law. For this purpose, the law postulates that architectural creation, without departing from the requirements of modernity, is subject to the principles of asymmetric parallelism. End quote. Importantly, the legislators did not call for a return to pre-colonial architectural traditions or any other architectural style, but invited architects to draw inspiration from them while adhering to modernism. So what did that look like? A prime example of the application of asymmetric parallelism is the Centre International du Commerce Extérieur du Senegal, commonly known as CICES, the trade fairgrounds in Senegal, by the young French architects Jean-François Lamoureux and Jean-Louis Marin. The convention center was completed in 1975, thus before asymmetric parallelism was officially codified. But the architects suggest that Senghor coined the term in response to their design. That's not confirmed whether that's true, but that's at least the claim that they made in an interview. The expansive complex, on the scale of a miniature city, boasted sweeping exhibition pavilions, a number of lecture halls, and a visitors center. And generally, it's very remarkable how many international trade fairs you find across the region that are of extraordinary architectural quality, a further representation of the idea of Pan-Africanism, where a regional trade and cultural interaction were supposed to be built on these based on these institutions. The entire complex is executed in exposed concrete. Asked about this choice of material, the architects explained that there was a cement factory nearby, whereas other materials, such as steel or even wood, would have required importation. According to Lamoureux and Marin, the use of concrete therefore signified an embrace of modern building materials as well as an affirmation of the specific economic conditions in post-independence Africa, and specifically Senegal. A view, by the way, which is broadly shared among leading architects in the post-colonial world of the global south. We see this in South Asia with many Indian architects embracing concrete. We see it in Brazil, Lina Bobardi. So the idea that concrete is somehow foreign to Africa or other parts of the global south is foreign to the architects who built in this period with this material. So from this perspective, concrete construction was in itself a gesture toward the Africanization of architecture. The triangular motif is the defining visual feature of the complex, almost obsessively reconfigured and repeated. It is not only prevalent in the pitched roofs of the pavilions, but serves as an organizing principle at all scales, from the footprint of the plazas and the silhouettes of the exhibition halls to the exposed structural system within, the shape of the portals leading to the exhibition spaces, the furniture, and even the profile of the handrails of the stairs leading to the elevated walkways. While this triangular obsession may easily be dismissed as a mannerism on the part of the architects, it provides a strong visual identity and integration of the complex as a whole, as evidenced also in the CICES logo. As a geometric abstraction of an archaic yet highly symbolic form of African architecture, namely the pyramid, the triangular motif would repeatedly surface in contemporary architecture as a powerful symbol of Africanization. According to Lamoureux and Morin, images of African villages were the inspiration for the design, and the loose grouping of the individual buildings around communal plazas would seem to point in that direction. However, the repetition of an identical motif on all scales, in this case a triangle, is a defining feature of fractal geometry, which has been identified not only as a structural principle of African textile patterns, but also traditional settlement architecture, and it also appears in Senghor's definition of negritude, as we have heard. In Lamoureux and Marin's account, Senghor required that notable local artists be included in the design process to compensate for the fact that the architects of this large-scale nationally significant project were in fact French citizens. Carefully selected to represent the country's different regions, the artists, including Amadou Ba, Seydou Barry, and Ousseynou Ly, among others, were each tasked with designing a relief that would give the front facade of each of the 7 regional pavilions a unique regional identity. Hence, one could say CICES, this trade fair complex, is characterized by an architectural scaffolding designed by foreign architects, yet superimposed with a layer of symbolic expression of cultural specificity in the form of reliefs by local artists. In a discussion of strategies of adoption or adaptation of Western ideas and concepts, it is worth comparing CICES to other convention centers in the region from that period, namely the trade fair complexes in Accra, here on the left, Ghana, and Lagos, Nigeria, on the right. Unlike CICES, these 2 projects were designed by architect teams from the socialist world, Yugoslavia in the latter case, and Poland in the former, although the complex in Accra was designed under the Ghanaian chief architect Victor Adegbite. The architects' nationalities demonstrate shifting geopolitical alliances in a region that was seeking to assert its independence on a global stage, independence in particular from the former colonial powers. As compared with CICES, which embraced a modern material and architectural expression, but adapted to the specific economic and cultural context of Senegal, the Lagos and Ghana trade fair compounds are deliberately much less rooted in the local context. While the decentralized organization of the Lagos Trade Fair, which you can see here, with its circular pavilions, evokes the structural logic of an African village, in fact, the architects conducted extensive field research on traditional settlement patterns, some of the sketches of the architect relating to another project in the state of Kano you can see here. The architectural expression and the choice of materials of the project evoke space-age imagery and present a marked contrast to the fabric of an African city. The same, of course, can be said of the Accra Trade Fair, whose central circular pavilion was clad in a shiny aluminum envelope as if a spaceship from another time and world had descended on the site. The Accra complex exemplified President Nkrumah's intention to employ a more generic vision or version of modernism so as not to give preference to any ethnic group in the newly established multi-ethnic nation-state, a concern which was shared by other independence leaders across the region. Thus, the circular pavilion, or the circular aluminum roof, was intended to recall the shape of an umbrella to signify prestige and power while conveying a sense of inclusion. Both these trade fair complexes represent situations of adoption characterized by a deliberate flattening of cultural and national differences in order to foreground internationalist and Pan-African aspirations. They invoke the promise of a bright future grounded in technological and material advancement. And in this sense, both designs adopted techno-utopian worldviews widely prevalent in both the capitalist and the communist spheres during the Cold War. But to return to Dakar, the iconic triangular silhouette of the CICES complex brings to mind the forms of the pyramid. The archetypal form is resonant in a number of prominent designs from the post-independence period. The Senegalese architect Pierre Goudabi Atepa's office from 1977, which you see here, has the shape of a truncated pyramid, for example. More akin to a graphic abstraction of the pyramid, the building communal, which is the municipal administration building in Dakar, features a screen facade made up of a pattern of triangles. The triangle is also a historical figure of traditional architectural ornamentation originating in the medieval imperial state of Takrur, where it spread across large swaths of the Sahel. Another, more literal reference to the ancient pyramids is the unrealized project for an acropole de négritude in Dakar by the French-born architect Henri Chaumette, which I'm showing you here. In its title, which unmistakably anchors the project in President Senghor's cultural politics and philosophy, indicates that the frequent occurrence of the pyramidal form, and by extension, its graphic abstraction in the shape of a triangle, in this specific historical context is not a coincidence. Indeed, the pyramids of Giza and the Egyptian high culture more broadly received a remarkable interpretation precisely during this period. If Egypt had long been seen as a cradle of Western civilization, prominent black historians and intellectuals argued that ancient Egypt, with the pyramids representing its most monumental accomplishment, had in fact been a genuinely African civilization. The iconic office tower La Pyramide by the Italian architect Rinaldo Olivieri in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, which defines, in fact, the city of Abidjan's skyline, underlines the currency of the prototypical form of the pyramid even outside Senegal, the immediate site of the Negritude philosophy. With its metal cladding and futurist interior that evokes a space-age aesthetic yet again, the building is quite distinct from the more traditional materiality of the Senegalese examples. However, in its double embrace of the imagery of both ancient Egypt through the notion of the pyramid and the space age, Olivieri's design eloquently embodies the conflicting temporalities of modernism in West Africa, thus evoking Senghor's mandate for an asymmetric parallelism. To conjure an idea and image of Africanness in their designs, architects also went beyond the visual tropes of the pyramid and the triangle. In Senegal, two prolific French-born architects, yet again, Fernand Bonamy and Henri Chaumette, looked toward the formal and material features of the traditional Sudano-Sahelian architecture of the region for inspiration for some of their most significant buildings. Again, here two historical examples of that style. Specific to the semi-arid grasslands of the trans-African region of the Sahel, Sudano-Sahelian architecture is primarily constructed in mud brick and adobe plaster, with the more monumental structures of this style featuring wooden beams that jut out from the walls, as evidenced most prominently in the Great Mosque of Djenné in Mali. So Sudano-Sahelian architecture has a massive stereotomic appearance that features rough haptic plaster surfaces in earthy tones, two characteristics that would seem to be at odds with the tenets of modernism. Two buildings by Fernand Bonamy are particularly noteworthy in this context of adapting Sudano-Sahelian or trying to adapt Sudano-Sahelian to modernity. The first is the private residence of President Senghor on the Corniche north of Dakar's Plateau neighborhood. The building, which you see here in a number of photographs by François-Xavier Gebré, was completed in 1978, 2 years before Senghor stepped down from his long tenure as head of state. Besides the ubiquitous ornamental and structural application, again, of the triangular motif, the stately building, with its blocky, fortress-like appearance, features a rough plaster treatment in earthy tones reminiscent of the most iconic examples of Sudano-Sahelian architecture. Notably, as we have seen, this traditional style of architecture is explicitly mentioned in Senghor's law regarding the application of asymmetric parallelism to contemporary Senegalese architecture. It is only consistent, then, that Bonamy would draw from historical examples of regional architecture to align with Senghor's mandate and the underlying philosophy of synchronizing the past with the present and the future. The student dormitory complex of the Gaston Berger University in Saint-Louis in the north of the country speaks a similar formal language. Besides the elements already identified in Senghor's residence, this large housing complex features other motifs, such as permeable ornamental screens to shade and passively ventilate the hallways, or rectangular gargoyles that evoke the protruding wooden beams of the Great Mosque of Djenné, as well as, of course, Le Corbusier's often copied waterspouts in buildings such as his monastery in La Tourette in France. The complex is remarkable in the context of Senghor's vision for contemporary architecture, also on the level of the plan. The individual dormitories are arranged around a central courtyard in order to enhance a sense of enclosure and community, while 7 of these clusters are in turn grouped around a central plaza. The fractal organization of space speaks to what Senghor, discussing the concept of negritude, had described as a, quote, pattern of community-mindedness that is exemplified in concentric communities scaled up one over the other from the family to the kingdom. These are all Senghor's words in a system of what he called reciprocal integration. I think this building is almost a literal translation of this idea developed for literature, basically, into the realm of architecture. The other French-born architect who was active in Senegal I would like to discuss is Henri Chaumette and his multinational Bureau d'études Henri Chaumette, or BEHC, which is quite noteworthy. So Chaumette, born and raised in France, studied in France, then as a very young architect wins a competition of the International Union of Architects to build the presidential palace of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, which doesn't get built, but it launches his multinational office. He has 22 officers running across all of the African continent throughout the 1960s and 70s, and is really transforming, the image of many of these places. He was not only a practicing architect and designer, but also reflected theoretically on his position as a foreigner operating in post-independence Africa, and more broadly on the impact of modernization on the continent. In this regard, he differentiated 3 periods of intervention by Europeans using modern techniques in Africa. And I want to quickly talk about sort of his historical or historiographical conception, which is, of course, somehow romanticizing, or actually, you know, somewhat rather romanticizing, but nevertheless, I think quite telling to understand, you know, particular way he thought about working in Africa as you know, as somebody who was born elsewhere. So according to Chomet, after an initial period of traditional architecture, there followed what he called boat period, and then an aircraft period, and then the period of modern architecture. And with that he means his own, you know, contemporary time, so the second half of the 20th century. During the boat period, according to Chomet, European settlers lived with very little contact with their places of origin. Quote Chomet, they were African by circumstance and often by heart, and understood the problems in terms of resources and local needs. So rather romanticizing, but then he distinguishes that from the aircraft period, which he's very critical of. So that's the early 20th century period. The French colonial apparatus had been bureaucratized and centralized. Decision makers were far removed from the actual sites of action, and prefabrication was the typical building strategy. And then Chomet's own period, then that of modern architecture, which contrasted markedly with the preceding era. In the words of Léon Noyer-Duplay, who wrote a PhD on Chomet, it was, quote, no longer about designing and exporting architectural models from Europe, but about living Africa, adapting to Africa, to its soil, climate, and its means of production. So in this theorization, it didn't matter that he, Chomet, had been born in France. What mattered was that his architectural production was deeply grounded in the specific economic and cultural context for which it was designed by means of adaptation. As a matter of fact, Henri Chomet's BEHC set up local offices in each of the countries in which they were active, resulting in work that is highly regionally specific. The engagement with Sudano-Sohilian President and Senghor's tenets can best be studied in some of Chomet's buildings in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. For example, the white pebble facade of his auditorium building at Dakar's Université Cheikh Anta Diop mimics the material roughness of Sudano-Sohilian plaster walls, while the pattern of cubes ornamenting the ground floor brick facade seems directly inspired by the typical protruding wooden beams that we've seen earlier. The facade of the headquarters of La Société Ivoirienne de Banque, so a major bank in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, with its characteristic earthen colors, similarly displays a horizontal organization, rough materiality, and protruding cubic elements, but here on the scale of an entire city block and crowned with a high-rise tower. The rhythmic articulation of horizontal bands on the main facade, alternating between massive, rough plaster walls and sleek, transparent windows, seems to interpret asymmetric parallelism as a dialectic juxtaposition of traditional materials and ornamentation with industrial means of production. So glass, industrial means of production, and sort of the plaster walls as a reference to traditional architecture. We can go further. In Dakar, Cheikh Ngom's Faisal building in the Plateau district of Dakar displays a similar system of horizontal layering on the facade, but the material dichotomy is here further exaggerated with the massive elements forming sculptural geometric ornaments. Ngom is widely revered as the first Senegalese-born modern architect, and besides Pierre Atepa, the only one of his generation who was able to garner significant commissions alongside his French colleagues. Besides the Faisal, a number of his high-rise buildings punctuate Dakar's skyline, including the headquarters of the Banque Centrale des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, and also the another bank building, which is a collaboration with Atepa and the Fahad building. This brings me to my conclusion. Modern architecture provided the leaders of the duly independent nations of Western Africa an instrument to articulate the promise of liberation. The buildings they commissioned stood as symbols of progress and change, and as incomplete realizations of a future yet to come. The architectural historian Nnamdi Ele has stated that by the 1960s, quote, the deployment of architecture as a metaphoric citadel of hope, a symbolic motive for guiding national development policies, became a prevailing modus operandi, end quote. Architects and political leaders pursuing ideas of nation buildings through culture employed a number of strategies to Africanize architecture. While one camp rejected the notion that a traditional architecture could serve as a basis for a new Africa liberated from its colonial bonds, the other saw such precedent precisely as the precondition for truly self-determined and self-reliant societies. Depending on their point of view and operating along a gradient, architects gravitated toward the adoption of modernist architectural language with its futurist outlook, or conversely, toward an adaptation of that language to the specific cultural and economic context. Either way, their buildings stand as testimony to an extraordinary age of hope and experimentation when architecture was tasked with constructing a genuinely African modernity. So that's the formal part of my lecture. I thought it might be fun to show you just very briefly a few images of sort of the research project, how we accessed archives. As you can see from this long list of lenders, this was an extraordinarily complicated and complex project that includes dozens of lenders from, I think, 17 countries, not only from the African countries that we look at, but of course also from many other places around the world. We, of course, worked with the co-curator, Ike Mokoye. We also worked with a curatorial advisory board, which includes many of the leading scholars in the field, and also a number of research assistants in the specific countries that we looked at, who really helped us establish contact with the families, helped us, go to the archives and manage the project on the ground, while, we, of course, couldn't always be there. I already mentioned, some very maybe surprising parts of the world where some of the material comes from here. Again, Israel as an interesting example of what Israel was to the African world in the 1950s and 60s, also perhaps in contradistinction to today. Eastern Europe, I mentioned, the socialist world, which formed a international connection of solidarity, very prominently represented. We, of course, also include the work of prominent artists from Africa. Here, the wonderful work of two photographers, Paul Gojo and James Barner from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, respectively. We include the work of African-American architects, including, of course, the great J. Max Bond, who not only taught at the Kwame Nkrumah University in Kumasi, Ghana, for several years, but also built a number of incredibly remarkable library buildings here. One example, which was part of the literacy project of the Ghanaian government. Then, Alan Vaughan Richard is a highly experimental artist, architect, originally coming from Britain, but then fully becoming a Nigerian citizen and, building these remarkable experimental houses that are kind of like blueprints for ecological architecture of our own time. Now here, this is a look into the university archives of the architecture school in Kumasi, where you see how we were able to source some of these incredible drawings from these drawers with the help of wonderful colleagues who navigated us through this complex organization. I've already shown this, many visits with architects to the degree that they were still alive, or their families, of course. And then, of course, also some more, troubling aspects where, lack of resources often led to also a lack of the organization of archives, where we really relied on sources, help on the ground to help us find things like this. Extraordinary representations of architecture. Here, one of our collaborators in the car, who, without whose works we just could not have done this project. Or, here more examples. So I think with that, I would like to end and, of course, open the for questions and comments. Thank you so much.
So we have microphones here. Please, if you have questions. I have a good number. There was such a rich overview and amazing architecture to discover that most of us, of course, knew nothing about. And Max Bond, by the way, built a building on our campus, the GeoChem building. I should
you
have
didn't
shown
show me that.
No, exactly. And so we have a connection there. But please, there's microphones. If you have any questions, suggestions, observations. I was really astonished by that wonderful story about asymmetric parallelism, and the trade fair grounds seemed to immediately bring that to mind. Were there other examples where those rules that were suggested to architects were translated in such a direct fashion?
I think some of the buildings I showed towards the end also speak to that. Some of Chomet's work, Shaken Gomes, where I'm sort of making the point, let me just, there's a very long list of slides. I think this is really a sort of, I'm making the argument here, maybe it's here, for example, I think, I think you can really see his reading of the Sudano-Suhelian style, but then, of course, also being a modern. And here, I was struck by this juxtaposition of glass and sort of this plaster, and I'm reading it very literally as a dialectic between the two worlds that he's trying to embrace and synthesize. And so, I do think it was widely adopted. This is a very successful, I think, example. One of my favorite buildings in Dakar, the Immeuble Faisal. It's an apartment building by the great Shaken Gomes, who gives this a degree of plasticity and vividness. I really think it's a very successful project that also speaks to this asymmetric parallelism, in my opinion.
Oh, there's a question. Yes.
Hi, yeah.
Jake.
I was wondering about construction techniques, and you mentioned that, forgetting the project, but in one project you have sort of European architects that are constructing the scaffold, and then you have the skin that's built by local artists, and I'm wondering if that's a pattern where local construction techniques are sort of adopted, and how that interplay, I guess, works, and if there's if it shows anywhere in the examples.
I think that's a great question, and I think it goes to the very center of the problem, as it were, what it would have meant to construct an African modernity. And we're basically, talking about a region that has not been industrialized, and so many of the things that are implemented through government policies are, of course, aspirational. The reality is that, in order to build a building like this, you still basically relied on the expertise of foreign companies. So the colonial, dependency continues to some degree. And I think what we see, I call it a scaffolding. You could also, of course, be a little more cynical about it. But what we see is at least sort of an attempt to culturally reflect, the need to transform into something African. And I think at the basis, we're still talking about, the apparatus of global capital that flows into these countries. It's very prominent in Francophone West Africa, where, most of the buildings continue to be built by French architects, by French construction companies, by material that is imported from France. But I do think there are, and this is what I try to highlight. The architects I'm interested in are genuinely interested of sort of coming away from these dependencies, and in some instances is also mandated. In Ghana, for example, we have this interesting policy where, unlike in Senegal, by the way, where architects not from Ghana, not Ghanaian-born architects, could only be commissioned to build something in the country if they collaborated with a local architect. So the idea was to use the construction as a training ground for a first generation of actually Ghanaian-born architects. So these policies of Africanization, which were really trying to transform the very structural foundation of the discipline of architecture beyond also the construction technique. But your question is very much at the center of some of the contradictions or aspirational sides of this body of work. Yeah.
Jonathan?
I have a question kind of about the public opinion on some of these movements, especially in asymmetric parallelism. Obviously, these are very influential works. They really showcase the aspirations of these countries, and they really are like a flexing aspect of where these countries are and where they want to be. But kind of working in class, we also talked about some of the public opinion, the other side of things. Maybe people that thought that the use of resources and time and money and energy was a little bit too flourishy or too excessive when it could have been spread out to other areas of the country. So I was wondering, since asymmetric parallelism was brought into law, what the public opinion was?
It's a good question. I don't think I have an answer. I don't think there is a wide, conversation in Senegal at the time about, what this meant. What I think underlies your question is sort of, I think the perception, I think it's to some degree a justified perception that, we're talking about an elite project here. I mean, many of the buildings that I showed were, commissioned by governments or by powerful organizations to represent an idea. And, that idea continued, of course, to be, in many instances, very far apart from the lived realities of, the citizens of these countries. At the same time, I also showed you the library by Max Bond. I do think there is, also a genuine interest to democratize and make accessible, a notion of Africa that is forward-looking to a larger population. But of course, we're talking about incredibly complicated economic, situations and conditions that architects by themselves and in itself cannot resolve. I do think it is worth noting, though, the attempt to do so in the instances where I think it's successful. Yeah.
Great. This was really fantastic. Before I thank you, I just wanted to acknowledge our intrepid photographer. Very good job, dude. Thank you. And
who is from West Africa?
Oh, yes, there's one more question. Yes. Sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
To preface, I'm currently taking a research studio at RISD about American bicentennialism and the large failures of the movement of urban renewal in that era. Mm-hmm. So I was just going to ask a wider question about the relationships between different movements where it seemed like it was largely successful in Western Africa with Pan-Africanism, whereas in the same time frame, American bicentennialism kind of collapsed and never came to fruition, or in more specific areas like post-Yugoslavian architecture, which you've studied, or in Southeast Asia. Do you think these different movements have relationships to one another or overlaps in interest?
I do think, I think there are very clear parallels and even overlaps between Eastern Europe, South Asia, and West Africa. In fact, as I'm trying to show, some of the personnel was even exchanged. There were even also, I didn't even talk about this, many architects from the subcontinent working in Africa at that, at that time. So, India, of course, the first big country that, reaches independence from Britain, stands as a beacon for decolonization for Africa. And so it's not surprising that, they're also looking at that part of the world. So there's a lot to be explored also, I think, in these South-South connection. I can't really talk about, maybe I'm not sure I understand your question fully, how that relates to American bicentennial. You mean the celebration 1976, and so it's not something I've thought about. So, but it's an interesting question. Yeah.
All right. On that note, I thought it was a fantastic lecture, eye-opening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Martino Stierli. Thank you.